Live.
Good evening, engagement group. This is Dave Preekshot, Senior Environmental Specialist at the District of North Cowichan, welcoming you to our engagement session where we'll be talking about the climate modeling that we've been working on for tracking emissions and how that's going to be rolled into the larger planning that we're doing to reduce North Cowichan's climate emissions and ultimately adapt policies for climate mitigation and extending the original CAPE. I'm just going to start off with a general introduction and begin by acknowledging that I am on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish First Peoples, and we always like to thank them for allowing us the opportunity to enjoy this area. I'm going to just start with a general agenda of what we hope to do this evening. We're going to start off with presentations from myself, Sean Chadburn, who many of you know has been working in North Cowichan on the Climate Action Plan for several years, and our consultant, Jeremy Murphy, who's put together the update to the Climate Action Plan modeling with some folks at Sustainability Solutions Group, which we'll call, you'll hear us referring to as SSG from time to time. I would like to just also remind folks that if they have any questions during the presentation, that those questions can be sent to environment@northcowichan.ca. So we're kind of hoping that this is going to be a little bit or as informal as it can be in this sort of a format. And I just want to apologize up front for having to use such a clunky way to try to engage folks. But as we're all aware, COVID has put a lot of burden on meeting face-to-face with folks. And so the conversation that we're initiating tonight, we know that it's not as open as a lot of you would like. And I want to assure everyone that it's our hope that as this conversation progresses in the future on PlaySpeak and ultimately through COVID, that we can have more of that face-to-face stuff where we can have more spontaneous types of conversations that we'd hope this would be. So thank you for bearing with us, and thank you to the engagement group who, the folks who agreed to participate. I'm just going to acknowledge the folks that said they were going to be participating in this process, and that was representing Halalt was Caitlin Kenny, and some guys from the former Environmental Advisory Committee, Cameron Campbell, Doug Fenton, Sandy McPherson, and Peter Nix. We have Kate Miller, Coralie Breen, and Austin Tokarik from Cowichan Valley Regional District, who we're going to be listening in from the City of Duncan, Michelle Jeannot, from the Chemainus Chamber of Commerce, Lori Frankson, Cowichan Green Community, Judy Stafford, the Duncan Cowichan Chamber of Commerce. We have Karen Bresler and Pam Stover, the Chemainus Residents Association, Christina Godbolt. We have from the Maple Bay Community Association, Sheila Kitson, Quamachan Lake Neighborhood Association, Marilyn Palmer, the Cowichan Land Trust, Stephanie Cattell, from the Cowichan Estuary Restoration Conservation Association, Kurt Schulholtz, Cowichan Stewardship Roundtable, we have Genevieve Singleton, Cowichan Valley Naturalist, Bruce Coates, One Cowichan, we have Jane Kilty and Matt Price, from the Somenos Marsh Wildlife Society, Elodie Roger, from Cowichan Energy Alternatives, Brian Roberts, from the Youth Earth Guardians, Katia, apologies for my pronunciation, Bannister, and retired Environment Canada scientist Jeff Strong. So those are the folks, that's a subset of about 40 folks who we sent invitations out to who we thought would be particularly informative and helpful in us getting a handle on enriching our modeling in such a way that it speaks to concerns in North Cowichan and isn't missing out stuff. So our hope here is folks in this engagement group have seen some of our preliminary modeling and have been asked to provide some feedback. So while the presentations are going on, first myself and then Sean and then Jeremy, you'll see that we are trying to address the questions that were sent in After our presentations are over, we're going to move to a session where we're hopefully addressing any questions that come in live. Remember, those questions you can send to environment@northcowichan.ca. That can be done until about 7 o'clock, at which point we'll take a 10-minute break if we need to in order to collate some of those questions. And after we break, Naomi from SSG will take over, and she'll be taking the questions and addressing them to Sean, Jeremy, or myself as necessary. And we're probably going to run out of time before we can get to all the points and questions that you folks have sent us. And I can tell you that there's something like about 40, 50 questions that we ultimately got sent by the engagement group. So thank you very much for taking your time and effort to do so. There are some folks from the general public who will be watching. I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in to the live stream and remind you that you're also welcome to ask questions, and that everybody should remember that everything that was sent to us will be forwarded to the conversation threads and FAQs that we're going to be putting up on the PlaySpeak forum in a couple of weeks. That PlaySpeak forum will also have all the resources that you see here today, plus the video feed of these presentations. So I think that covers it all. I'm going to go into my presentation, general outline of why we're here and how this fits in with some of North Cowichan's strategic priorities, and I'll hand over to Sean. So as I said, I'm going to start with addressing the question of why we're here today. And one of the questions that kept on popping up was a concern over how this translates from the original CAPE. And I just want everyone to be assured that we're not throwing out the original CAPE. There is a lot of planning and a lot of strategizing and many policies that came out of the original CAPE that are still part of our strategic process. The purpose of the CAPE update that we're doing here is simply to improve the modeling that goes into informing our ability to create the new policies that come about because of technological change, or make our delivery of some of the old policies that we're already doing better. And also, SSG is going to be providing us with a modeling tool at the end of this project whereby we can monitor our emissions as time goes on, because I want this to become an ongoing conversation. So it's not something that just exists and then we plow it forward through time and hope for the best. This is going to be an active conversation. So the goal for today's engagement meeting is, as I said, the presentations from staff and SSG, and looking at your questions about the new CAPE modeling, the CAPE update modeling, and to really assure you that we want to take on board suggestions you guys have for changes to some of our modeling assumptions. We've already started those discussions, and Jeremy will get more into that during his presentation. And also hopefully look at some of your suggestions about the kinds of emission reduction policies and actions that we could take, while keeping in mind that the original CAPE is still there. We want to find out ways that we can make the stuff we're doing from the original CAPE better and more effective, and see if there's any new policies that we can come up with. And also, like I said, steps for the future, continuing this engagement. We have to report back to council on what we've achieved. And when we get to the finalized CAPE modeling update, use that to hopefully help make better decisions while we're tracking those emissions progresses with the policy analysis tool we're getting. So part of the problem, I think, in some of the questions that we're getting, or it's not the problem with the questions, it's the problem with the way that the terminology was rolled out that led to some of the questions and concern, and that is this overlap in acronyms between CAPE and CAP. The CAPE, as everyone know, most of the folks know who are watching the stream, is the original modeling and planning exercise that gave us what everyone recognizes to be a really solid approach to starting the climate change and emissions management process. The Cape update was simply a program that was initiated with funding from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and a little bit of money from North Cowichan to update the greenhouse gas emissions modeling and to do some tweaking to scenarios and take on board any new greenhouse gas reduction, greenhouse gas emissions information that we may not have included before, because when the first CAPE was done, there was still a pretty active investigation of what actually we were responsible for. So we think we've got that nailed down a little more solidly. And as your responsibilities change, and in this case, we're responsible for a lot more emissions in the new emissions modeling than we had been prior. So that's useful information because it alters, like the scope of what we need to do. So the Climate Action Plan, which you'll hear me refer to from time to time, is something that I was asked to prepare by council back in 2019. It was one of the first things that I did when I assumed my job here at North Cowichan. And that's simply a integrated climate action program, which takes all of the useful stuff and great work that was done in the original CAPE, and then take on board the information from the CAPE update, plus stuff that we learned from our community and some of the things that were just not on the table before. And in order to make these achieve these goals, the CAP is divided into 6 strategy areas, which include as much of, in fact, I think pretty much the totality of all of the items that were raised in the original CAPE, but also tried to take on board new stuff and to highlight the new stuff that was maybe not as much of a possibility before. So there's several issues in climate adaptation, which we won't really be addressing today, but will be part of the CAP climate action plan work that we do going forward. These are things like surface water storage, changing some of the policies we might want to adapt for shading and from trees and this sort of stuff. So that all that stuff is incorporated in a way, hopefully, that wasn't before. Not to focus too strongly on this admittedly eye-splitting chart. It's just meant to illustrate that the Climate Action Plan is integrating the CAPE update in order to try to make it speak meaningfully to a couple of strategic things that North Cowichan is doing. One is the official community plan, which is ongoing right now, and something that we're, definitely trying to keep up with. But because both are evolving processes, there's sometimes a little bit of disjointedness, but we are trying to speak to each other in such a way that the plans are growing together and are implemented without contradicting each other and leveraging each other's strengths. There's also Council's strategic plan, and one of the 6 focuses of Council's strategic plan is environmental considerations. So the Climate Action Plan speaks to that and tries to leverage it. And then there's the municipal corporate operational strategic plan, which is how things get done by the municipality, by staff, and how we speak to the public through community, and our community projects are, of course, a big part of that. So the Climate Action Plan is really going to be integrated into that, and with that, the CAPE is part of that. So many of you, well, I guess all of you have seen this if you got the information package, but this is a couple of slides following that I've done before, just to remind people that when we're having this conversation, that we're having this conversation with a diverse group of folks who may see the world differently. And in this case, we have 3 circles in this Venn diagram, which we all recognize are things that we can do, things that can work here, and things we would like to do. So we all recognize that those 3 separate things exist in coming up with plans. But the individual conception of how many of those things are changes by person. And so one thing I like to try to be sensitive to is that the way this Venn diagram looks for different people can very often depend on what their sort of worldview is. And so if you're someone who is really keen on trying to improve the environmental status of the community, you might see that there's more things that we would like to do and that there's more things that we can do or should be doing. But if you're someone who's a climate skeptic, you can say, oh, yeah, there's all sorts of things we can do, but there's not much that would work here. And there's not really very many things we might like to do because they don't really see it as being a germane conversation. And so you can see the overlaps get really small because there's things that, yeah, okay, we can do them anyways because it has other applications. And then ultimately, in North Cowichan, we're probably looking at some subset of things that work here. And I'm open to conversation on this topic, but I'm going to just discuss a few things that I think we have to keep in mind in the North Cowichan conversation when thinking about how we come up with action that we take in order to reduce our carbon emissions and to develop real meaningful policies to adapt to climate change that has already happened and climate change is going to happen in the future. And one of the ways, and most of us are aware of this, I mean, we've lived in the community, so we understand that there are things that make us different. And one of the more striking things is if we look at population density of North Cowichan compared to other similarly sized communities. So the two outliers over on the left-hand side are Vancouver and Victoria, which are there just for comparison's sake. But all of the communities you see, other than Vancouver and Victoria on this chart, are municipalities with populations between 20 and 50,000 people. And you can see for all of those municipalities, and those are all the municipalities in BC with those parameters, North Cowichan is the second least dense. And what that means is that a lot of the options that we might like to examine are things that come out of work that's done in places with densities like Vancouver, Victoria, North Vancouver, White Rock, might be a little bit more difficult to achieve here, which is not to say they're impossible, but it just means that we need to be careful about how we devote our limited energies, both within our community and within our corporate structure, to creating those sorts of policies, because we are, in many ways, more like Mission and Salmon are. And secondly, again, if you've been around here, you'll know that the District of North Cowichan is quite distinct from some of the other communities around here. And this shows the breakdown of our population, male and female halves of our population by age categories. And one thing that really stands out in this comparison is that our population is much older. The most common age category in the district of North Cowichan is people between 60 and 69 years old, whereas in British Columbia as a whole, it's 10 years younger. And Duncan skews a little bit, about 5 years younger as well. And you can see in Cowichan tribes, it's almost the inverse of North Cowichan's situation. So for a lot of the planning that we're necessarily going to need to do with our neighboring communities, we have to understand how these differences in age categories is going to influence the way that we implement climate change policy that's going to be meaningful for those age categories, while we're also trying to plan a community that maybe has more younger people. And so how do those types of aspirations in the OCP or in other types of planning influence things like the kinds of housing or transportation strategies we employ, or ones that are possible even? One of the big things is also there's a lot of material that's available from bigger centers in terms of climate planning that they're doing. And Victoria, for example, put out an excellent climate action plan last year, which has a lot of great programs and great ideas for addressing climate change. But when we were asked to have a look at those sorts of ideas, this is one of the things that really strikes you is when you look at where emissions are coming from, we have a lot larger industrial emissions and they have almost no farm emissions. And the conversation has come up a few times as to why we have changed the scope of what we're talking about and whether or not we're responsible for different types of emissions. But one of the things that we have discussed before is how farms can be helpful in North Cowichan changing its emissions patterns. And so if we're going to adapt farm policies or take on farm policies, then we have to be aware of how those emission patterns affect our community as a whole if we're going to sponsor that sector of the economy. Secondly, with industry, there's been a little bit of confusion over what North Cowichan is responsible for industrial emissions. North Cowichan is responsible for all industrial emissions from entities that are emitting less than 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So that's pretty much all of our industrial emitters except for catalyst mill. So when we say that North Cowichan industrial emissions are about 140,000 tons per year, that's all of the small scale emitters put together. So that is something we need to address, and it's something that we're mandated to take care of. So as I alluded to before, there is no intention to abandon the original CAPE in terms of the policies and strategies it recommended, but what we came to realization of was that there's a lot of things that have fundamentally changed. I talked about how agricultural and industrial emissions are pretty significant in our community, and that those weren't considered in the original CAPE. And we need to understand how those change in order to move forward. So that's one of the big things that was really taken on board. Secondly, there's been several questions that we got about how carbon sequestration fits into some of the work we're going to do going forward. And carbon sequestration is definitely part of the stuff that we are interested in tracking, but it's getting a handle on what that sequestration is. And so I've had a lot of interest in what might happen with the Municipal Forest Reserve, and as most of you know, that conversation is ongoing. But even in the best case scenario, in terms of sequestration, in the modeling that was done by 3 Green Tree and UBC, if you saw the presentation they gave a couple of weeks ago, you'll see that at most we could get about 20,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year sequestration, and our total emissions as a community in North Cowichan is about 340,000 tons per year. So it's just about 6% at best. And if we went to the what was called the 50% harvest strategy, it'd be about 3% of our emissions. So I think sequestration is important in terms of moving forward, but it is probably not going to get us out of the whole, but will be definitely part of the whole story. And you'll see Jeremy and SSG have incorporated that into the plan. And just in terms of thinking of farming, a lot of this strategizing around how we were going to build farms in the future is built on the assumption that a lot of small farms are going to be delivering some of the gains that are to be made in greater carbon efficiencies. But although we have a lot of small farms, the left-hand graph shows the number of small farms by size, how that changed between 2011 and 2016, you can see that most of our farms the vast majority of our farms are less than 69 acres. But when you look at the total area farmed by those farms, you see that more than half of our farmland is on farms that are actually larger than 70 acres. So 60% of our land is on farms bigger than 70 acres. So the conversation about how these sorts of things change is going to be influenced by the farming policies, but the farming policies also need to be aware of what we're dealing with, not only in numbers of farms, but also in the total area of the land farmed. Lastly, there's been a few assumptions in the original CAPE which have changed, and there's been some skepticism directed towards the assumption that we can get to the goal of having the vast majority, if not 100% of our vehicles as zero emission vehicles. But this is taken from Transportation Canada's official policy. And I know many people see that as being optimistic, but if it's not EVs, it is other types of zero emissions vehicles. It's getting people into alternative transportation. And it's not even meant in the modeling perspective of saying we are going to have 100% of people in zero emissions vehicles. but it gives you an idea of the scope of emissions reduction that you need to achieve from something like that. And so if we're not going to get it from moving those vehicles, then we have to get it from other places. And this is why people are so interested in continuing the conversation in places like land use and more dense housing and these sorts of policies which are going to help get people out of vehicles. It's definitely on the table and part of the discussion we're having. And we want to do a better job of letting everyone know that that is something we're considering. And so I think I just got looking at just in terms of updating from the old CAPE versus the CAPE update, just where some of those emissions have changed, and so why the numbers look so different. It is pretty dramatic in some areas, but definitely I think means that we have to think a little bit harder about how we deal with emissions from some of the sectors and face up to what we're responsible for reducing in order to get to North Cowichan's target of 80% reductions from our 2007 emission level by 2050. And the next step of this, we're going to be looking at things called, not in today's presentation, but when we start the discussion on the types of strategies we can do, we'll be looking at things called abatement curves, which I don't want you to necessarily focus on each individual item. This is an abatement curve on the left for the United States economy. And you can see there's all sorts of little things that the United States economy can do to reduce its carbon emissions. So the reductions in emissions are the x-axis. So the wider the bar is, the more carbon emissions you are reducing with that thing. And so for the United States, the biggest single thing they can do is revenue neutral carbon pricing. So getting that sort of price on carbon is something that's been an active conversation at the provincial level here and federal and state levels in the United States. But you can see, for example, that some things which are more significant elsewhere, like vehicle electrification, is a tiny little sliver in the States because so much of their electricity right now comes from coal infrastructure. So our marginal abatement curve is going to look slightly different than this. It's probably going to have fewer items, and that's like that Venn diagram I was showing you. There's going to be fewer places where we can get big gains. And so one of the things we really need to address is, and Jeremy will outline this, is where are the kinds of places that we can get gains so that we can then begin to talk about an estimation of what the costs or benefits are of trying to work towards those different gains. It says questions, but the questions are for you to mail in. So I'd just like to remind folks that if they have questions about what I've just talked about or what Sean and Jeremy are going to discuss, please send those questions to environment@northcowichan.ca. And if we have enough of those questions, we'll take a break after Jeremy's presentation and try to collate those questions. And Naomi will take over and facilitate setting up the presenters with those questions. Thanks very much for your time, and thank you for bearing with us, which I totally appreciate that this is not the forum that most folks would have preferred us talk to. I'm going to hand it over to Sean now, and I'll talk to you all in a bit.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. So yeah, as they've mentioned, I'm Sean Chadburn. I'm the Environmental Programs Coordinator here at North Cowichan. I'm just going to start off by acknowledging that Dave may have missed one person in the room, and that's Tracy Fleming from Cowichan Tribe. So welcome, Tracy. We're happy to have you here. So to start off, I'm going to go, I'm just hearing the dinging, just one second. Okay. Start off, I'm going to go just go over an outline of what I plan to present today. So hope to provide an overview of legislation and policy behind the climate action in North Cowichan. So you have to bear with me for the first few slides. Then go over some highlights of the municipality's accomplishments with regards to climate action and energy plan to date. Then I'll go over a brief history of the municipality's Climate Action Reserve Fund and the organization's carbon neutrality history. Okay, so in 2008, the Local Government Act and Community Charter were updated by the provincial government, and this included legal obligations for local governments to adopt GHG or greenhouse gas emissions targets in the official community plans, or also known as OCPs. You may hear that acronym throughout. So in 2011, North Cowichan updated its OCP to include 3 targets. And these interim targets were, from what I understand, were intended to be updated once the 2013 Climate Action and Energy Plan was adopted later. So the 3 targets chosen were based off, from what I can see, were very similar to provincial emission targets, and they were as follows. Achieve carbon neutrality as soon as possible, achieve a 33% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, and sequestering more carbon than we produce. So in 2012, North Cowichan hired a Sustainability Solutions Group to model the community's greenhouse gas and emissions and create a climate action plan. And after extensive engagement with the community and the Climate Change Advisory Committee, I think was their name at the time, North Cowichan Council formally adopted its first climate action energy plan in 2013. So from there, staff developed an implementation and monitoring framework with the Climate Change Advisory Committee, composed of community members, of which a lot of them are on the call today. And this implementation and monitoring framework was adopted in 2014. For those that don't know, this is essentially a simplified summary of the Climate Action Energy Plan, because it's a very large document. But it came with an accompanying list of actions to be completed and a framework on how we would monitor and measure success of those actions. Oh, I missed one little piece. In 2014, the council also decided to implement one of the action items from the 2013 Climate Action Plan, and this was the Climate Action and Energy Plan Reserve Fund. So this is essentially a green revolving loan fund for North Cowichan. Essentially, staff, if they had a project that would potentially save energy or reduce North Cowichan's emissions, they would essentially put a proposal forward to council, and if council agreed, the fund would pay for all or a portion of that project, with the idea that the energy savings reaped from doing that project would essentially, the annual energy savings would pay back into the fund until that loan was paid off. And then basically you're continually growing that fund by doing more projects, and it's going to enable you to do more projects in the future. And the more money that it builds, you can essentially do bigger scoped projects. So now I'm just going to go over, highlight at a real high level. This is definitely not inclusive, but just go over a high level of all the actions done under the old Climate Action Plan and Energy Plan since 2013. By no means are they inclusive, but it gives a good cross-section of what we've done in the various sectors outlined by the original Climate Action Plan. So we'll start with the first one, the creation of the CAPE Reserve Fund, the Climate Action and Energy Plan Reserve Fund, and the development of terms of reference. So I described kind of how that fund worked already. North Cowichan also around this time partnered with BC Hydro, and they created a corporate energy manager position and a community energy manager position. Unfortunately, this funding has since been discontinued by BC Hydro. But these 2 positions resulted in a significant amount of projects, including the Better Off North Cowichan home renovation retrofit program that was led by the community energy manager at the time, and then the LED streetlight project. So we converted all of North Cowichan's ornamental streetlights to LEDs, saving a whole bunch of energy. Other projects like the lighting upgrade at the Cowichan Aquatic Center, among many others, which I think I'll touch on a later slide. Transportation. So operations staff at North Cowichan did a fleet management review. So essentially looked at how many vehicles North Cowichan has, how many employees, how much each of those was each one of those vehicles was used, and basically enabled us to point out which vehicles we needed and which we didn't, as well as bringing in 2 electric vehicles, which one of them is pictured here. So we replaced 2 internal combustion engine vehicles with electric Ford Focuses, and installed chargers at the municipal hall. What else? In addition to this, the municipality purchased and installed EV charging stations for the community members in Crofton, Chemainus, and at the Regional Visitor Center. Staff have also developed a bike network plan that was approved by council, and this included design guidelines for different modal types and priority connections for future years, which will help us when we're doing capital budget planning and improve our chances at getting third-party funding usually from higher levels of government. Through that, the addition of bike lanes is essentially now a standard consideration for any road construction projects that we're doing. And going to my next slide. There we go. Land use. So since 2013, a Parks and Trails Master Plan was finalized by our Parks Department, and this was adopted by Council after significant input from the community. The Planning and Development Services team have done local area plans for Chemainus, Crofton, University Village, and the Bell McKinnon local area plan. Those have all been adopted by Council. And then, of course, what Dave was speaking to earlier, in 2020, work began to update the official community plan in North Cowichan. So staff are sharing information from the 2020 Cape modeling with the consultants working on the OCP and the staff working on it. And we're providing an environmental lens on the OCP project, in addition to all the other community members on the OCP advisory group. Some of you are probably here today. I know a few of you are. Next slide. So energy, as I mentioned, many initiatives under the corporate energy program, which I helped complete when I first started at North Cowichan. Variable frequency drive water pumps at Boys Road Water Treatment Facility. So these pumps supply all our residents on the South End system. Essentially allows them to ramp up and down rather than just an on-off function, which saves a lot of money. In terms of pumping water, we did energy audits on 7 major municipal buildings like the Municipal Hall and the Aquatic Center. We did the LED streetlight project, which is pictured on this slide. So we converted all the municipal streetlights that are owned by the municipality to LEDs. We completed the solar preheating of domestic hot water at the Cowichan Aquatic Center. Better Off North Cowichan program. That was a community energy project aimed at improving energy efficiency in residential dwellings. We purchased a electric ice resurfacer, also known as a Zamboni, with proceeds from the reserve fund, and that helped to stimulate this conversion. We rescheduled all our emergency generator testing. This one was this one kind of came about randomly, but it ended up saving about 14,000 liters of diesel fuel annually and around 49 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. So fairly major. Agriculture, my lovely daughter right there on the slide. We've worked a lot with the Cowichan Green community here. They commenced their incubator seed farm on Beverly Street with land leased that was provided by North Cowichan in 2016, and that project's really starting to take off now. The CGEC will provide an agricultural educational center, which will also serve as a community seed bank. So teaching new and experienced farmers how to produce and save their own seeds, among many other things that they do. North Cowichan also worked with Cowichan Green community to provide a little seed funding to help help them start an agricultural equipment lending library. So the idea is, farm equipment that can improve efficiency on a small scale or large scale farm for that matter, that maybe someone can't justify purchasing themselves, but you can rent it for fairly cheap through the Cowichan Green community, and it'll be available to everyone. So, and then the Bonsall Creek Watershed Management Plan as well. And of course, the municipal forest was another sector that the original CAPE talked about or had a focus on. The municipality has a no net loss policy for municipal forest lands. So the council passed a policy that sets a maximum savings of 1.8 million in forestry profits to acquire additional municipal forest reserve lands. And obviously, most people on this call are probably aware of the strategic forest planning review and technical analysis that started in 2019. Adaptation. So the last plan had a little bit of that mixed into it as well. So we've done extensive diking projects in partnership with Cowichan Tribes and the City of Duncan, as well as the CVRD. And asset management review is being completed as directed by council. So, the way that fills in is, knowing what infrastructure we have, its condition, and its replacement value is pretty essential when you're doing any adaptation measures, just to know what we may need to implement in the future and where we may be vulnerable. So let's get into corporate emissions and offsets. So for the next section, I'm going to go over some background information about the emissions produced by North Cowichan as an organization. And from a local government perspective, there are two types of emissions. So there's corporate and community-based emissions. So that when I refer to corporate emissions, these are ones that are produced, by running the pool, running the heaters there, or municipal fleet vehicles that staff are driving around in. Whereas community emissions are ones produced, through people heating their homes or driving their own vehicles around the community rather than staff. So important to know the difference. Thought I would get that up front. So this graph here shows the North Cowichan's corporate emissions, so the gross emissions in CO2 equivalent tons since 2012. So the corporate emissions are shown in blue. And as I mentioned, these are produced, from the municipal vehicle fleet or running civic facilities. The municipality is also required to report emissions from services that we contract out to consultants. So, if we're doing a big road construction project, or running our annual curbside recycling collection through a contractor, that's gross contracted emissions. So those show up in red in this graph. So overall, corporate emissions can vary each year depending on how much natural gas is used to heat a building or how many construction projects are undertaken by staff and consultants. But in general, we can see that the corporate emissions have remained relatively constant since 2012, despite increases in services offered to the public and increases in staffing. So next, I'll go over corporate GHG emission offsets. So these are things that we net off of the gross emissions, and we get credits for it to the province. So this does not include the energy reduction projects that I mentioned in the corporate energy slide that I just talked about a few slides ago, because those essentially reduce our gross emissions rather than netting them off like these ones do. So as you can see, the green bars, North Cowichan receives an annual offset credits for operating a curbside organics program. So this is collection of your kitchen waste and whatnot. So by avoiding the landfill, we get a credit for that. And then the blue bars portray an emissions offset credit from the avoided development of the forest in Echo Heights, which was a subdivision in Chemainus that likely a few of you remember. But in this case, this was municipal land. It was eligible to be changed into a development or residential housing subdivision. And the council of the day decided to preserve 91% of that land, the 20 hectares, and you get credits for this. So as you can see, the project, you get a large offset in the very first year, 2014. And then excess credits roll over into future years. So, and then you also get an annual credit every year as well. So over the 20-year lifespan of this project, it will result in approximately 5,700 tons of net emissions for the municipality. So this slide, this graph shows the net corporate emissions. So these are gross corporate emissions minus the offsets that I just talked about. And this is what we essentially claim to the provincial government as our carbon neutrality status. So as you can see, the organics program and Echo Heights emissions that peaked in 2014, 2015, 2016 allowed us as an organization to be carbon neutral. In 2017, those credits that were rolling over essentially ran out and weren't enough to maintain carbon neutrality. And the council of the day directed staff not to purchase carbon credits to retain its carbon neutrality status. With that being said, the municipality has completed a significant amount of projects to mitigate our effect on climate change since 2013. And the lack of increases of emissions is something worth celebrating, in my opinion. So thank you, Heichka. I hope this presentation provided a basic overview of municipal actions and policy on climate change since 2012, and in some cases actually a little bit before that. We received a few questions over the past week that kind of pertain to my presentation. So I'm going to answer a few of those now, but as Dave and others mentioned, feel free to email in those questions to environment@northcowichan.ca. So one of the questions was, how do CVRD policies influence North Cowichan's GHG plan? I think there's a few linkages here for sure. Few examples would be transportation planning, which is public transportation planning, which is overseen by CVRD and BC Transit. And obviously that would affect our community emissions over time. Some of this information is contained within our model. Solid waste management is also co-managed between North Cowichan and CVRD staff, and we often work pretty closely together on doing some solid waste initiatives. Another one would be climate change adaptation planning, which the CVRD is currently undertaking a lot of work on this in this field. And environment staff at North Cowichan have been participating in those discussions and working closely with the CVRD as well. Another question was what building codes and energy incentives to promote home energy efficiency. So in 2020, North Cowichan Council provided $30,000 from the Climate Action and Energy Plan Reserve Fund, which went towards the Better BC Homes program, which it's a provincial program aimed at increasing home energy efficiency and reducing GHG emissions from the existing housing stock in North Cowichan. This program started July 1st and will run until the top-up dollars essentially have been used up. But there will still be, additional provincial funding until they run out of funds as well. Council also gave first and second readings and third readings to an amendment of the building bylaw to implement the BC Energy Step Code. So this is obviously aimed at, producing new homes that are highly energy efficient and incentivizing homeowners to build more efficient homes. So they provided $30,000 towards that as well. So I think that's it for the questions I've had. And so I will turn it over to Jeremy. Thank you, everyone.
Just before Jeremy takes over, I want to just acknowledge to Tracy that what happened was an example of my failing eyesight and me trying to take a clever shortcut to try to make up for that by increasing the size of the font in the Excel list I had with everyone's name. And as I switched it to a smaller window so I could see this and that, the top line was cut off. So my apologies, Tracy. You're a victim of my failing eyesight. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Dave and Sean. And thanks, everyone, for dedicating your Monday evening to this. It's great to be back working with North Cowichan again on energy emissions initiatives. I was one of the primary authors of the original CAPE, and happy to be back working on it again with more capacity in our modeling. As was mentioned before, this is very much a modeling update. So we are updating the modeling that we did several years ago with new, better, more precise data that is available that wasn't available 7 years ago. We have improved assumptions that accompany that data for our modeling scenario purposes. And we have improved modeling capability. The model that we used for the original CAPE was a complex Excel-based model, but Excel-based models are kind of limited in what they can do in this type of energy emissions and land use modeling. We've since upgraded our modeling to a software platform which is much more complex and just allows us to really get into a lot of detail and precision with the different actions that we can explore. So it's a more powerful model, gives us more powerful outputs that we can put towards developing and updating the CAPE actions and policies. So you'll remember from the original CAPE and it's the same with this CAPE. We have several kind of high-level goals that we explore with the modeling, and we're looking at, obviously reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We want to reduce overall energy use in the community. Correspondingly, we want to reduce energy costs. We want to lower household energy costs and commercial energy costs to save people money. We want to mitigate risk from climate change. We know if climate change goes unaddressed year over year, the impacts grow. So we want to mitigate those impacts. And of course, we want to increase quality of life with all the actions and policies that we take. We don't want to have climate change action come at the expense of quality of life or be a sacrifice. We want to do it in a way that increases quality of life and has lots of different co-benefits for health and socioeconomic indicators and that sort of thing. We also want to do a few other things. Like we want to check in on the CAPE progress, which Sean gave a great update on. We want to update the modeling with the new data and see where that gets us. We want to confirm the emissions reduction target, which was done a few months ago with council approval. So we have the 8% emissions reduction by 2050 as compared to 2007 levels. And we also, as Dave mentioned, want to create the emissions tracking capacity so that we can tell year over year the progress that North Cowichan is making on achieving that emissions reduction target. So those are the goals that we're considering as we go through the modeling update here. And in terms of the modeling work plan, this is what we've done so far, kind of on the left hand of the slide here. We started the project at the end of the summer last year. In the fall, we did all of the updated data collection. So originally for the first CAPE, we relied a lot on provincial data sets, which were a lot of averages, a lot of high-level data. For the updated data collection, we did use some provincial data, but it's not really averages as much anymore. A lot of it's actual data from energy use. So our data precision has increased, which is really great for modeling, and modelers are always very happy about better data sources. We calibrated the new model with it, and from that we got what's called a data methods and assumptions summary, and that is the summary of all of the data sources and all of the assumptions that we've made for the baseline inventory and for the modeling setup, so that we kind of know what assumptions have gone into assessing these scenarios. And so from that, we've modeled the business as usual scenario. So kind of what happens with energy emissions over the next 30 years if no emissions reductions actions are taken. So that is our 2050 mark with no major interventions in the next 30 years. We get a report out of that, which we can analyze for the trends that we're seeing in all the different sectors like buildings, energy and emissions, transportation, energy production and use, waste, etc. As I mentioned, we already confirmed our emissions reduction target. And then we get into the fun work of doing the low carbon scenario modeling. And so that's where we've made a bunch of assumptions across a whole bunch of different sectors in North Cowichan, similar to what we did for the first Cape, and modeled those assumptions out to the year 2050, assessing kind of what some potential actions and policies would do in terms of emissions reductions. And that gives us this low carbon scenario presentation that we're seeing right now. This is the consultation phase that we're in. After this consultation phase, we'll take all of the inputs that you've given us, all the discussions that we've had, and we will refine the actions and the modeling. So we'll refine the assumptions that go into this. If any new data sources come to light, or if there's any precision that can be added to the data, we will refine the modeling to include those. And then next steps after that are the action and implementation planning, which is really kind of updating what is in the original Cape and making some updated considerations for technological advances that have happened or any other related developments in North Cowichan since the last Cape. And then the project completion later this fall. So there's your timeline. Now we'll get into some of the modeling outputs here. So the basic demographic assumptions that we have, these are updated from the last Cape. We're starting on the left-hand side of this graph in 2016, and then we're looking forward to 2050. And we see over that 34-year time period. I should mention we use 2016 as a baseline year here. Because it's a census year and we have good data, good energy emissions data, good demographics data for that year. We are tracking all of this modeling back to the base year that the original Cape was based on, 2007. But just for the purposes of this presentation, it's a little easier to go with the 2016, that precise data base year. But we haven't lost sight of that 2007 year. So over the next 30 years here, we're expecting just under 10,000 new jobs to come to North Cowichan. Just over 9,000 people are going to move here. And then we have a decrease, actually, of a little over 1,000 vehicles and an increase of almost 900 homes. And so these are the assumptions, like the trends, the outlooks that we've taken from a few different sources, statistics sources. These aren't set in stone, they're assumptions. We can change them if we have better data to update these assumptions. But interestingly, the vehicle decrease is a curious data point, and it's due to the aging population. So aging population, retiring population, homes are downsizing their vehicle stock. So across North Cowichan, it's anticipated at least that about 1,000 vehicles fewer will be around in 2050. So those are some of the basic assumptions that we make, which are kind of drivers for new emissions in the community. So we have, the population growth is really contributing to increased energy use in home and transportation, the demand for commercial services, the transportation services demand, production of waste and wastewater, and also consumption of potable water. So you can easily imagine as populations grow and as employment grows as well and housing grows, the demand for those things increases per capita. Similarly, employment growth has kind of similar effects on the demand for those items. And then housing growth, in Greenfield at least, and we consider housing and building addition in all sectors in the modeling, but for greenfield especially, there's a slew of things to consider as emission drivers, including the extension of the electrical grid to new developments, natural gas line extensions if they're using natural gas for home and water heating, all your system extensions for all of the municipal services. And of course, it also increases the vehicle kilometers traveled as you grow. So those are some of the emissions drivers. One thing that has changed since the original CAPE several years ago is the development of energy and emissions inventory standards. So when we did the original CAPE, we kind of did the best job we could in terms of investigating all the different energy uses and emissions sources across the community. And it was really our own system, that was kind of loosely used, but mostly customized for North Cowichan, loosely used in other jurisdictions. Since then, there's been standardization of those inventories. And so what we're considering in North Cowichan now, some of the emissions scopes have kind of shifted around a bit from our original CAPE into these categories. And so we're really considering scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, everything from agriculture, forestry, and land use, our buildings, fuel combustion, the waste that's generated in North Cowichan, the industrial processes, which is a new addition. We didn't used to have good industrial data in North Cowichan, and the original CAPE doesn't include industrial data because of that. But since then, we have gained access to industrial data, and so we can be more precise about that. That's including scope 1 and all of the transportation within the community. And scope 2 is the grid supplied energy. And then scope 3, we address half of scope 3 actually. So we're not addressing indirect emissions like things that would come from shipping freight internationally or something. The in-boundary transportation grabs that commercial transportation emissions that are local, but we're not including things that are kind of shipped from overseas as part of that, for example. And we're not including out-of-boundary transportation through things like airport travel. But we are including waste generated inside the city and disposed of outside the city. So North Cowichan still ships a lot of its waste out of the jurisdiction, so we're including that. And we're also including the transmission and distribution emissions of both the electricity grid and the natural gas lines. And you'll see all of this in some future slides here when we show the graphs. So one thing that was mentioned before that we are not considering in the modeling is the Catalyst Crofton paper mill emissions. If we did, the graphs you're about to see would be useless to us because it's very high emissions output from Crofton paper mill. So we are not including that. Also, we're not including it because it's a facility that generates over 10,000 tons annually, which puts it squarely into the provincial reporting requirements. We are including agriculture, and we have better agricultural data now than we did for the original CAPE. So the emissions on agriculture, the data that we have, much better, and we're able to model it now more than we were previously. They're the scope 1 emissions that I mentioned, and mostly they're due to livestock emissions. Again, agriculture is largely under provincial jurisdiction. We have some actions on it in the original CAPE, and Sean gave an update on how some of those are going. There is kind of limited influence that the municipality has over agriculture, but it's a partnership, and we work with all levels of government to try to advance it. Now, we're going to be talking about energy and emissions numbers next. And it's really hard to get a grasp on the meaning of them. So here's just a quick comparison when we're talking about gigajoules. And we'll be talking about millions of gigajoules and millions of gigajoules that North Cowichan is using every year. And so 1 million gigajoules are about 278 megawatt hours of energy. It is equal to about 20,000 passenger vehicles worth of energy a year, about 28 million liters of gas, or 24,000 homes electricity use for 1 year, or about 10,000 homes energy use for 1 year. These aren't North Cowichan specific numbers. This is from Natural Resources Canada, and so these are cross Canada numbers. But it gives you a good rough idea of what we're talking about here. When we're talking about 1 million gigajoules, we're talking about 10,000 homes worth of energy use. So that'll give you an idea of what we're talking about for energy use. And similarly, thinking about emissions it's tough to grasp. I mean, what is 1 ton of carbon emissions? And this is 1 ton of carbon emissions. This is a sphere that is about 2 stories tall. So that's 1 ton of carbon emissions. And we are talking across North Cowichan about hundreds of thousands of these every year. So hundreds of thousands of these spheres in North Cowichan year over year. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of how to conceptualize these numbers that are kind of ethereal sometimes. All right, here we go. So this is our current path, our business as usual scenario of energy and emissions outlook for North Cowichan community. So on the left-hand side of these graphs, we have our total energy use up at just over 9 million gigajoules. We have our total emissions production at almost 350,000 tons. And that's our starting place with our good data and our good census year in 2016. And the updated modeling, the projections with the new assumptions, the new data that we have is showing that, you know, all things being equal, under the current plans that North Cowichan has, the current market trends, the current, promises of other jurisdictions of government, we're increasing our energy use slightly in the next 30 years. And correspondingly, the community emissions are going up slightly in the next 30 years. So a 5% increase in energy use and a 1% increase in emissions, which is not very much really. Many other communities are going up quite a lot more than that. So North Cowichan is about even. And this is what it looks like when we break it down by sector. So we have our agricultural, our industrial, transportation, residential, our commercial and waste sectors. And in the emissions, we also have our fugitive emissions. And remember, I said when I was talking about scopes, that is the transportation of natural gas. So that's the transmission of natural gas. It has fugitive emissions associated. So you can see in the energy use graph on the left, industry is accounting for over half of the energy use in North Cowichan. As we saw in the original Cape, of course, transportation, the commercial, residential buildings, using the rest of that energy in North Cowichan, but industry is really strongly represented here now that we have the data. And correspondingly, you know, the emissions are similarly weighted. So, you know, about a third of the emissions across North Cowichan are industrial related, a third are transportation, and then, you know, the rest is due to the residential, the commercial buildings, as well as the agricultural waste and fugitive emissions. And you can see as time goes on for the emissions, there's a little bit of industry being added to North Cowichan over the years. So the industrial emissions are increasing, industrial energy use is increasing. The transportation emissions are decreasing slightly. And so that's in part due to those 1,000 fewer cars that I mentioned that will be on the road by 2050. It's also due to increased fuel efficiency standards and carbon content standards. And it's also, the modeling also includes an assumption for electric vehicle uptake. So there's a modest electric vehicle uptake consideration. And then we have the agricultural sector. We haven't assumed any changes in the business as usual scenario, so that it's going to remain roughly constant. Residential and commercial, only small changes there. So that's the business as usual, the current path, energy use and emissions outlook here over the next 30 years. And here's how it breaks down by fuel source. So you're wondering where all the energy is coming from and what type of energy is creating the emissions. This is it. We have grid electricity, which is accounting for about half of the energy used across the community. And then a big chunk is being supplied by natural gas, in home and commercial heating and water heating, and then the gasoline and diesel from transportation, and then a little bit of wood, propane, and a few other mining sources for energy use. Any of your solar electricity would be included in that other category. And then, correspondingly, the emissions, most of it, a big chunk of it coming from natural gas, and then a lot coming from the transportation sector with the gasoline and diesel use. The agricultural sector, of course, with its consistent green bar there. And then a little bit from grid electricity, because BC grid is not 100% clean. We still import a little bit of dirty, so-called dirty electricity on occasion. So this is what the fuel sources look like and their associated emissions for energy use and emissions production across North Cowichan. And in case you're wondering, this is how it breaks down by the end use. So industrial processes, again, are accounting for almost half of that energy, transportation for a big chunk of that energy. But then interestingly, the space heating, the lighting, the plug loads, this is how it breaks down in buildings. Just a tiny bit of cooling, your major appliance use, and your water heating there at the top. So we can see that these are the end uses that we can focus on for our energy use reductions and our corresponding emissions reductions. So obviously industrial processes, a large chunk of that effort to be made, and then the transportation and the different building energy uses. We can focus on those. All right. So I'm giving you the breakdowns, and I'm going to go back up to the top to the summary. This is where we are in 2016. We're at that 338.6 thousand tons of emissions. And the business as usual, that current path that we're on in 2050, we are going up to that 341.9 thousand tons. We want to go to an 80% reduction of 2007 levels, down to that 61.1 mark in 2050. So that means from 2016 at least, we need to achieve that 280,800 tons of reductions. And so you'll remember if you're familiar with the original CAPE, we had a slate of actions and policies, and we showed each one and how it would achieve those reductions. And we've updated the modeling, and I'll show you a similar chart in a moment here, right after we go through some of these strategy sectors and how this investigation goes and what we've done. So there are 6 main strategy sectors that we're focusing on, and they're aligned with that protocol about the emission scopes that I showed you a few slides ago. So they're these 6: the compact, complete communities actions, how land use is dealt with, how building situation and our transportation network is arranged. We have our efficient buildings sector, both for existing buildings and for new buildings. We have our water, wastewater, and solid waste sector. What are the efficiencies we can gain there? We have our low carbon transportation, and that includes all the personal transportation as well as public transit. And then we have our local clean energy generation and procurement. So we can make clean energy locally within North Cowichan, and then we can also buy it from outside of North Cowichan if needed. And then finally, our carbon sequestration, which people in North Cowichan know well through the Municipal Forest Reserve, is possible. So these are the 6 strategy sectors that we've been investigating. And some of the main changes in these sectors since the original CAPE was done several years ago are the following. In the building sector, we have the BC step code now, so new buildings are more efficient by default, and that's getting more and more efficient over the next 12 years. We've had advances in heating and cooling technologies, so maybe some of you have them or you've heard about heat pumps. BC Hydro and the province have heat pump incentives to switch over your home heating to heat pumps. They're 300% efficient compared to baseboard heaters, so this is an exciting newer technology that we can consider. And there's advances in building retrofit techniques, so lots of new approaches to insulation and building envelope considerations. For energy, we have seen a dramatic drop in the price of renewable energy technology. So solar photovoltaic energy, for example, is much, much cheaper to purchase and install than it used to be. And we've also seen an increase in the availability of energy storage technologies. And that's important for storing renewable energy so that if we ever needed to draw from the grid during kind of a peak demand hour of the day, for example, instead of drawing from the grid and instead of drawing during a time when we're importing dirty energy, we can draw from energy storage. And so this is an exciting technology that is advancing rapidly. So right now we're kind of familiar with it in terms of lithium-ion batteries, for example. In the transportation sector, we have way more electric vehicle models than we did 7 years ago. I think 7 years ago we had 3 or 4, maybe 5, and now we have, dozens. So a lot more choice, a lot more market demand for these types of vehicles, and the prices are decreasing. And we also have faster charging equipment, so it's more and more viable to get into electric vehicles and low emissions vehicles. In terms of policy, we have seen an increased ambition and level of detail from provincial and federal governments in their climate change goals and their objectives, policies, and plans. So there's a lot more support than there used to be, I would argue. I think it used to be municipalities were kind of leading the charge in a lot of cases. Now we've seen more support coming from provincial and federal governments, and so that gives us more opportunities to partner with those jurisdictions and really push some of our actions forward. And lastly, we have improved access to data sources, much more specific and more sectors available. So especially the industrial sector, the agricultural sector, our data is much better. And our modeling sophistication has increased, so we can be more precise and we can be more sure about what we're projecting in our scenario model. And as I mentioned when I was talking about the scopes, we have the standard now for the energy and emissions inventory reporting protocol. And that's nice because it puts everything into boxes that we can manage, and it's very consistent. And so we can now more easily compare North Cowichan's progress in its emissions reductions through its inventories against any jurisdiction in the world, and we can be sure that we're comparing apples to apples that way. All right, so that's the context. That's a few of the things that have changed since the original CAPE was authored. And here, I'm going to just take you through the action and policy sectors here to present to you a little bit the assumptions that we've made in the modeling. So I'm going to focus on the right-hand side and the low carbon modeling components of the assumptions we've made. The middle column is the current path, that business as usual trajectory that I've showed the overview in. That's all those graphs that I broke down by fuel type and by emission source and all of that. That's the current path we're on. Before I present the low carbon equivalent of that, let's just go through some of the assumptions that have been made that have built that scenario. So first off, we have our spatial distribution. We've been rigorous in how we determined the distribution of anticipated development, really concentrating it in the south end. So 80% of new housing that is expected over the next 30 years, we're focusing it in the south end. 10% of that will go to Chemainus, 10% to Crofton. There may be, occasional buildings that are made outside of those zones, still within the urban growth boundary, of course, but this is kind of the cut and dry sort of assumptions that we've made for spatial distribution. As we kind of densify a little bit and as we see in housing trends Canada-wide, the dwelling size is expected to decrease by about 20% by 2050 on average. So the average dwelling size of North Cowichan homes will be a little smaller in 2050. And then the building type mix is partially responsible for that. We're expecting to see more multifamily homes as part of new developments, so that by 2050, only 10% of new buildings are single family homes likely. Again, these are some assumptions we've made. These aren't set in stone. If we have a good justification for changing these, we can do that. But this is what we're going with to see what the effects of some low carbon actions and policies can be. So for new residential buildings, those new developments that are expected to come on, we are anticipating in the low carbon scenario, at least we're modeling, that new buildings are net zero energy by 2030. So they're not, they're a little bit better than net zero energy ready, as in the current path scenario, the business as usual scenario. They're net zero energy by 2030, and the same for both residential and commercial buildings. For existing buildings, which is really where we have to focus in terms of the majority of energy and emissions savings, it's easy to get caught up with the excitement of new buildings, but it's really the existing building stock that merits most of the focus here. So the low carbon scenario assumptions we've made in terms of retrofitting homes by 2040, close to 100% of existing buildings we would like to retrofit to 50% thermal and electrical savings. Same with commercial buildings. For industry, we haven't made really precise assumptions around all the different things that industry can do to be more energy efficient and reduce its emissions. But we are assuming that through market forces or through partnership forces, industrial emissions will decrease by 50% by 2050. Still a chunk of emissions will be left in industry, but we're hoping at least 50% will be reduced. The municipal building retrofits, we're treating the municipality as a leader in this field, and assuming that 100% of existing municipal buildings are retrofit to net zero emissions by 2030. And then I mentioned heat pumps earlier. We're going to assume that 100% of heating and cooling is electric by 2050. So those retrofits, those home retrofits, commercial retrofits, we're assuming that all heating and cooling is going to be electric by 2050. And then quite ambitious assumption around solar PV. So adding solar photovoltaic arrays to 90% of homes, which will meet 50% of their electricity needs by 2050. So a big rollout of solar PV. In terms of water, wastewater, and solid waste, we're assuming that as the potable water pumping efficiency and any wastewater pumping efficiency that exists in North Cowichan comes to its end of life, they're being replaced with more efficient pumps. So we're assuming a modest 2% increase in pumping efficiency every year until 2050. We're also assuming through kind of behavioral change, through incentive programs, we can decrease water volume use, potable water volume use by 2% a year by 2050. So we're hoping to get that water efficiency up in buildings. And then the waste diversion targets are at 90% of residential and industrial, commercial, institutional waste diverted by 2050. So a high waste diversion target, and an even higher organic waste diversion target, 95% by 2030. So just in 10 years from now. In terms of our low carbon transportation assumptions for the low carbon scenario, we have transit mode share increase. We expand transit, we increase the frequency on transit routes to achieve a 25% mode share. So 25% of trips are made by transit in 2050. We're also, there are plans by BC Transit to electrify that transit. So they have plans that 100% of their fleet will be electric by 2030. Similarly, we want to encourage electrification of municipal fleets. So low carbon vehicles in the municipal fleet, 100% of them by 2030. And naturally, we want to increase and improve cycling and walking infrastructure so that 35% of trips are walking and cycling by 2050. So that active mode share added to the transit mode share, we're looking at 60% of all trips being made by low carbon means in 2050. And then new electric personal vehicles. We're pushing an assumption here for 100% of new car sales are electric models by 2030. So this would be in partnership with dealerships, this would be in partnership with charging suppliers, This will be in partnership with other levels of government to be aggressive on the market uptake of electric personal vehicles. And similarly with commercial vehicles, 100% of all new commercial vehicle sales are electric models by 2030. Now, in terms of local clean energy generation, we're thinking, we have an assumption around solar PV. So this is ground mounted. So I mentioned earlier about 90% of buildings having solar PV. So that's on building solar PV. This was more like small solar farm type, small utility scale solar PV installations. So this would be over, parking lots or in unusable areas somewhere. Installing at about 1 megawatt capacity a year, probably starting in 2022. So by 2050, you would have just under 30 megawatts of solar PV capacity added to the grid. The district energy system assumption is that we are adding a new district energy system to University Village to serve the large thermal energy users there. That energy storage technology that I mentioned earlier, we're assuming that as you install the solar PV energy, we're also installing some storage when storage technologies become cheap and available. 18.5 megawatts total by 2050, so that it can store 10% of that photovoltaic generation. We haven't assumed any wind energy. The wind energy studies show that North Cowichan isn't great for wind energy, unfortunately. But we have assumed some renewable natural gas use that is supplementing, or replacing rather, the natural gas use throughout North Cowichan. So 100% of the remaining natural gas that hasn't been, that is still in use after all the energy efficiency gains have been made, will be replaced by renewable natural gas or hydrogen by 2050. That's our energy generation. And those are our 6 sectors that we're focusing on. So we've made several assumptions that we've run through now, and this is how it stacks up in terms of the actions, kind of the proposed actions. Again, the actions aren't set in stone. These are kind of what we have assumed in the low carbon scenario modeling that we've done. This is what it looks like when we stack them all up. So that top line at the very top across the graph, you'll remember that top line from the summary graph I showed toward the beginning. That's the business as usual line. And then all of those colored wedges are those actions, those policies that are eating into the carbon liability, the carbon that is left over year, that big gray chunk at the bottom of the graph. So as we implement all of these actions and policies, the gray wedge in that graph decreases and decreases out to 2050. And so we can see from all those assumptions that we've made about all of the actions in the low carbon scenario that the personal vehicles electrifying, those introduction of more and more low carbon, low emissions vehicles is very important. And that's mostly due to the longer trips. So the trips that are leaving North Cowichan, going up to Nanaimo, going down to Victoria, that emissions wedge on the graph is really what is addressed by electrifying personal vehicles, those longer trips. The industrial energy efficiency, I mentioned that 50% increase in energy efficiency, the 50% emissions reductions from the industrial sector, that is a huge chunk of the emissions reductions graph here. Then we have the hydrogen in buildings, replacing the natural gas that is currently in use in buildings that is responsible for so many of the emissions. Hydrogen is going to address a lot of those emissions. Forest management, the sequestration components of the municipal forest reserve, managing it properly accounts for a sizable chunk of the emissions reductions out to 2050. And then we have a renewable gas purchasing, which supplements the other part of the, or rather avoids the other part of the natural gas use in combination with hydrogen. The home retrofits that I mentioned, that 50% reduction in thermal and electric energy in homes is that bright blue wedge there. And then capturing the renewable gas from wastewater treatment plants in North Cowichan using anaerobic digesters is going to supply some of that renewable gas for the thermal energy and also prevent it from escaping into the atmosphere from the wastewater treatment plant. Then we have the heat pump wedge that I mentioned and electrifying the commercial vehicles. So those are the big kind of chunks on this graph, right? Those are the big policies, the big actions that we can take to really make a sizable dent in the emissions reductions working toward our target in 2050. And this is what the top of the graph looks like. So there's 16 or so smaller actions in terms of smaller achievements of energy or emissions reductions that help us inch toward the emissions reductions target. I've included the electrify commercial vehicles again at the bottom of the graph for reference. And then it's all of those other ones that I mentioned in the assumptions, going through the assumptions about the transit service, the switching out some of the building energy technologies, the active transportation, the municipal building retrofits, all of these little emissions reductions that we can take through all of these actions. And a lot of these smaller actions have going to be synergies with the larger actions. So they're all important to get us to that target. And here's where we get to when we put it all together. So you'll remember a few graphs ago, I showed the scope, the scale of the challenge. Here we are. So we have at the top of the graph that 2016 baseline where we started. And at the bottom right-hand part of the graph, we have our target. And through everything that we've modeled, we've gotten very close to the target. So a lot of the assumptions are very ambitious. They get us very close to the target. We have a 3,100 ton reduction gap estimated in 2050. So we've done the vast majority of the work. If we can implement all those actions and policies successfully, monitor them over time, make sure that they're having the effect that is intended, we get very close to that reduction gap. And I'll talk a little bit about what we can do about that gap in a few minutes. But in the meantime, I wanted to break it down the way we did for the business as usual scenario. So this is the low carbon scenario. And this is the same setup with energy use graphs on the left and emissions production on the right. Here's what we have under the low carbon scenario. Energy use, we see it decreasing a lot in the industrial sector, in the transportation sector especially, and also in the building sector, commercial and residential buildings. Agriculture, we've kind of assumed is going to remain constant for now. But you can see the effect in the emissions graphs, especially on things like vehicle electrification, low carbon, low emissions vehicles, just going almost to zero, that orange wedge on the graph. Is a very dramatic decrease in emissions from the transportation sector. A big decrease from the industrial sector, of course, under our 50% reduction assumptions that we've made. The agricultural emissions remain constant. The residential and commercial buildings emissions are going down, not quite to zero. There's still, a little bit of emissions from the electricity grid, a tiny bit of natural gas use that hasn't quite been eked out of the system, but very close to getting to zero in those sectors. And then the yellow wedge at the bottom of the graph is the ramping up of the municipal forestry reserve in terms of tree planting, getting more and more that carbon sequestration potential to further reduce our emissions. So that's what it looks like by sector. And then by fuel source, you can see how the energy in North Cowichan, the grid electricity is decreasing over time. So in 2016, it's about halfway up the graph. And then by 2050, we see a decrease, substantial decrease there. Natural gas, all the getting rid of natural gas in the commercial and residential sectors really helps make that wedge narrower and narrower as we get to 2050. The remaining natural gas mostly from the industrial sector there. And then we can see diesel and gasoline, those green and dark blue wedges, going to basically zero. Like there's no more energy coming from those fuels by 2050. And then The low carbon energy sources that we mentioned in the assumptions and in the actions that we showed. So our local electricity, our hydrogen, our renewable natural gas are coming online at the top of the graph, those three wedges at the top. So, you know, almost half, or at least, you know, about 2/5 of the energy in 2050 being supplied by mostly local renewable energy. And we see how that translates in the emissions graph. You know, the fossil fuel emissions are going to almost zero, except for the natural gas is still used by industry. And then, you know, we still have a little bit coming from the grid, we still have a little bit coming from agriculture, but we see this dramatic drop in emissions across all the fuel sources, the fossil fuel sources. So, in summary, North Cowichan has the 5 big moves, right? You could argue maybe 6 or 7 big moves, but really it's electrification of transportation. The electric vehicles, the low emissions vehicles are very important. Those longer trips are responsible for a lot of the emissions in North Cowichan right now, and they will be in the future if we don't adopt more low carbon vehicles. Replacing that natural gas with renewable natural gas and hydrogen is paramount to getting our emissions down. The industrial energy efficiency, now that we have the industrial information, we know that industry is responsible for a large chunk of those emissions. So we'll have to work with industry to bring those emissions down. The increase in the carbon sequestration in forests, as we saw in a few of the graphs, very important role to play here. And the existing building stock, the home energy efficiency retrofits, as well as the commercial buildings, including those heat pumps, are going to be key to getting North Cowichan's emissions down. So those 5 big moves, the lion's share of emissions reductions, right? It's 94% of the emissions reductions that we're achieving. And those other 16 moves, those other 16 policies and actions are responsible for that remaining 6%, and they're just as important to reaching our target. And so there are a whole bunch of different levers that we can pull to reduce emissions in North Cowichan. Now we have that 3,100 ton gap right at the bottom of the graph, if you'll remember, that we haven't quite addressed yet through all of these measures, through these ambitious assumptions. And how are we going to address those? And that's a discussion I think to have as to what we want to address in the modeling and what we think we can achieve and accomplish in terms of actions and policies in North Cowichan. Is it going to be further reductions in the transportation sector, for example? What can we do about agriculture? Can we do more in the industrial sectors? You know, these are or could we even do more for sequestration or local renewable energy production? These are kind of the 3, 4, 5 wild cards that we have that we can address that final 3,100 tons and get to our target in 2050. It's important to remember that the agricultural and industrial emissions are largely under federal and provincial control. There is a partnership role for those jurisdictions to play with North Cowichan and with the agricultural and industrial sectors to try to address those emissions. There's not necessarily a lot of really direct influence that the municipality has there, but it's very much a partnership and a trade-off game, I would say. And then finally, that little bit of emissions that remain in the transportation sector, there's potential for further reductions there. Some of that is going to be the commercial transportation, which is pass-through traffic through North Cowichan. A little hard to address, but that is going to be a partnership with commercial vehicle suppliers, with trucking agencies, with adjacent jurisdictions to try to reduce that remaining transportation emissions. So this is what we're left with after we take all the ambitious actions and policies in the low carbon scenario. This is what we're showing right now in the modeling. We can update some of these assumptions. We can tweak some of these actions and some of these policies to, if we have better information and more better data and assumptions that we can add to see if we can achieve that emissions reductions target that has been set. That is the modeling summary. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Jeremy. I note that we've received probably something like about 15 or 20 questions over the course of the presentations. So I would like to ask for everyone's patience as we will take a 10-minute recess in order to have a look at some of those questions and see if we can collate them in a way that makes sense. And Naomi will work on taking over a facilitation role to get some of those questions to me and Jeremy. So I read the time right now at 7:14. The meeting was supposed to, or the session was supposed to go until 7:30. So I'm going to perhaps ask for folks' indulgence in allowing us to go a little bit over time. I don't want to be too abusive of your time, but how about we reconvene at 7:25? Thanks.